The weight of the morning. The morning arrived cold and colorless, the kind of dawn that offered no comfort and made no promises. Private First Class James Holloway stood in the assembly area outside the temporary command post, his breath forming thin clouds that dissipated almost immediately in the November air. Around him, the rest of the patrol checked equipment with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this enough times to know that survival often came down to the small things: a properly secured canteen, an extra ammunition clip positioned exactly where muscle memory could find it, bootlaces tied with the right amount of tension to prevent both slippage and circulation loss. There was a ritual quality to these preparations, a series of movements performed in sequence, not because any manual demanded it, but because repetition created a framework of control in circumstances that otherwise offered very little. Holloway adjusted the sling on his M1 Garand, feeling the weight settle across his shoulder, in the familiar diagonal line that had become as natural as the weight of his own arm. The rifle was 8 pounds of walnut and steel, a tool he had carried through enough miles and enough firefights that its balance had merged with his own sense of physical space. He checked the chamber by reflex, confirming what he already knew: that a round was seated, that the mechanism moved smoothly, that the weapon was ready. The metal was cold enough to sting his fingertips even through the thin gloves he wore, a reminder that winter was closing in and that the war would continue through it regardless of comfort or preference. The patrol's objective had been briefed the night before in the dim interior of a requisitioned farmhouse that still smelled faintly of livestock and old smoke. They were to move northeast through a section of wooded terrain that intelligence suggested might be clear of German forces, conduct reconnaissance along a secondary road that connected two villages of marginal strategic value, and return before nightfall. It was described as a routine patrol, the kind of mission that appeared regularly on operational schedules and seldom produced significant contact. But Holloway had been in the European theater long enough to understand that routine was a designation applied by men who studied maps in relative safety, not by the soldiers who walked the actual ground. Every patrol carried the possibility of violence. Every stretch of quiet forest could conceal an observation post or a hasty defensive position. The war had taught him that the difference between a quiet day and a catastrophic one often came down to factors invisible on any map: a German unit moving through the same area at the same time, a local informant's tip reaching enemy ears, the random intersection of two patrols operating on independent schedules. Lieutenant Ashford moved among the men with the clipboard that seemed permanently attached to his left hand, conducting a final inspection that was more procedural than necessary. The men of the platoon knew their business, and Ashford knew they knew it, but the inspection served a purpose beyond verification. It was a moment of shared focus, a brief interval where everyone acknowledged the transition from preparation to execution. When Ashford reached Holloway, he paused long enough to glance at the rifle, then met Holloway's eyes with the kind of look that conveyed both confidence and caution. Nothing needed to be said. Ashford moved on. The patrol formed up in a loose column, spacing adjusted for the terrain they would be entering. Holloway found his position in the middle of the formation, a spot that offered neither the heightened vigilance required of the point man nor the rearguard's constant backward scanning. It was a position for steadiness, for maintaining pace and watching the flanks, for being ready to respond without being the first to make contact. He fell into step as the column moved out, boots crunching softly on the frost-hardened ground, the sound gradually absorbed by the forest as they left the cleared area around the command post and entered the trees. The woods were a mixture of oak and pine, the undergrowth thinned by the season and by the passage of other patrols over the preceding weeks. Visibility extended perhaps 30 yards in most directions before the vertical lines of tree trunks and the horizontal mass of bare branches created a visual static that made distant shapes ambiguous. The light that filtered through the canopy was pale and diffuse, offering enough illumination to navigate, but not enough to warm. Holloway felt the temperature drop as the forest closed around the patrol. the air inside the tree line somehow denser and more still than the open ground they had left behind. The soldiers moved with the careful deliberation that came from training layered over experience. No one spoke. Hand signals passed information up and down the column, adjustments in direction, alerts to obstacles, reminders to maintain interval. Holloway watched the man ahead of him and felt the presence of the man behind, the three of them forming a temporary unit within the larger structure of the patrol. His eyes swept the terrain in a pattern that had become automatic. Near ground for obstacles and tripwires, middle distance for movement, tree line for shapes that didn't belong. The Garand moved with him, its weight shifting subtly as he walked, always positioned so that it could be brought to shoulder in less than a second if the situation demanded it. They had been moving for perhaps 40 minutes when Holloway noticed the change. It was nothing he could have pointed to with certainty, no single detail that announced danger. But the quality of silence had shifted. The forest had been quiet before, but it had been the quiet of a cold November morning, a stillness punctuated by the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of a bird. Now the silence felt thicker, more deliberate, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Holloway saw the same awareness in the posture of the men around him, a slight tightening of shoulders, a fractional increase in alertness. No one had given a signal. No one had seen anything definite, but the patrol was responding to something felt rather than observed, a collective instinct built from too many days spent in places where the wrong kind of quiet preceded violence. Lieutenant Ashford raised a fist, and the column halted. The men sank into whatever cover was immediately available. Tree trunks, slight depressions in the ground, the sparse undergrowth that offered concealment if not protection. Holloway positioned himself behind an oak whose diameter was just wide enough to shield his torso. The Garand angled across his chest, eyes scanning the forest ahead. The silence deepened. Somewhere far to the east, artillery rumbled, a low, sustained thunder that had become part of the ambient sound of the front lines, background noise that soldiers learned to distinguish from the sharper, more immediate sounds of nearby danger. Minutes passed. Nothing moved in the visible sections of forest. No shots were fired. No voices carried through the trees. But the tension remained. A shared understanding among the men that something had changed, that the mission had crossed some invisible threshold, from routine to uncertain. Ashford waited, giving the moment time to resolve itself, allowing whatever had triggered the patrol's instinct to either reveal itself or fade back into the general background of wartime unease. When he finally gave the signal to resume movement, it was with a hand gesture that indicated reduced interval and increased caution. The patrol moved forward again, but the formation had tightened, the spacing between men decreased to maintain visual contact in terrain that now felt more hostile than it had 20 minutes earlier. The forest ahead narrowed into a natural corridor where the ground sloped downward between two low ridges, the trees growing more densely on either side, the available routes of movement funneling into a space perhaps 50 yards wide. It was terrain that made tactical sense if you were trying to move quickly between 2 points, and terrain that made equally good sense if you were planning to observe or interdict movement along that route. Holloway felt the calculation running beneath his conscious thought, the automatic assessment of exposure and vulnerability that came with walking ground where sightlines contracted and options diminished. The patrol entered the corridor because the mission required it, because the route had been planned and approved, because turning back based on intuition alone was not how operations were conducted. But every man in the column understood that they were moving into terrain that favored ambush, and that understanding sharpened everything. The way they watched the ridgelines, the way their fingers rested near trigger guards, the way each step was placed with attention to both speed and silence. The forest swallowed sound, the corridor closed around them, and the patrol moved deeper into the trees, carrying with them the weight of equipment, the memory of training, and the knowledge that what appeared routine on a briefing map could change in the span of a single heartbeat. First contact, and the collapse of certainty. The first shot arrived without preamble. A crack that split the silence and sent a round snapping through the air close enough that Holloway felt the displacement as a brief disturbance against his left shoulder. There was no dramatic announcement, no buildup of tension that signaled the transition from patrol to combat. One moment the forest was still and the patrol was moving in cautious formation. The next moment, the war had found them, and the carefully maintained structure of the mission began to fracture under the sudden application of violence. Holloway dropped, his body responding before conscious thought could process the situation. The ground was hard and cold beneath him, roots and stones pressing through his uniform as he flattened himself behind whatever cover the immediate terrain offered. Around him, the rest of the patrol was doing the same, soldiers scattering into defensive positions with the instinctive speed that came from training reinforced by survival. More shots followed, the reports echoing through the trees in a way that made precise location difficult to determine. The sounds overlapped and reflected, creating a confusion of direction that turned the forest into an acoustic maze where threat could be coming from multiple vectors simultaneously. The German position revealed itself incrementally, not through any single observable detail, but through the accumulation of muzzle flashes, the angle of incoming rounds, the pattern of impacts against trees and earth. They were firing from elevated ground along the northern ridge, somewhere between 50 and 80 yards distant, a range that was close enough for accuracy, but far enough to make immediate assault costly. Holloway pressed himself tighter against the base of a fallen log, his eyes scanning the ridgeline for definable targets. He could see movement, brief flickers of shape that might have been soldiers adjusting position, but nothing clear enough to justify expending ammunition on uncertain shots. Lieutenant Ashford was shouting orders, his voice cutting through the noise of gunfire with the kind of command presence that came from months of leading men through situations exactly like this one. The patrol was to establish a defensive perimeter, return fire to suppress the German position, and prepare to either advance or withdraw based on the tactical situation as it developed. The orders were sound, the kind of textbook response that made sense in the abstract geometry of training exercises. But the reality of executing those orders in broken terrain under active fire was vastly more complicated than any manual suggested. Holloway brought the Garand to his shoulder, feeling the stock settle against his cheek in the familiar position that had been drilled into him until it became automatic. He controlled his breathing, forcing air in and out in measured cycles, despite the adrenaline that was demanding rapid, shallow gasps. His finger rested on the trigger guard, not yet committed to firing, but ready to transition in the fraction of a second it would take to identify a target. The forest ahead was a confusion of vertical lines and horizontal shadows, everything moving slightly in his peripheral vision as his eyes tried to separate genuine threat from the visual noise of wind-stirred branches and shifting light. A German soldier appeared at the ridgeline, visible for perhaps 2 seconds as he moved between cover positions. It was enough. Holloway adjusted his aim, led the movement by a fraction, and squeezed the trigger. The Garand barked, the recoil pushing back against his shoulder with the solid punch he had felt thousands of times before. He didn't see the result. The soldier had already disappeared behind cover, but the act of firing served multiple purposes beyond hitting a specific target. It announced that the patrol was returning fire, that they were not simply absorbing the ambush but responding with organized violence. It forced the Germans to account for incoming rounds, to keep their heads down, to make their own calculations about exposure and risk. The firefight settled into a rhythm that was neither sustained nor sporadic, but something in between. Bursts of intense fire punctuated by brief intervals of relative quiet, as both sides assessed damage, repositioned, and prepared for the next exchange. Holloway fired when targets presented themselves, conserved ammunition when they didn't, and tried to maintain situational awareness beyond the narrowed tunnel vision that combat naturally induced. He could hear other rifles firing along the patrol's line, the distinctive ping of an M1 Garand clip ejecting, the heavier thump of a Bayar laying down suppressive fire. He could also hear the German weapons, the sharper crack of Kar-9 8K rifles, the ripping canvas sound of an MG-42 opening up from somewhere farther along the ridge. The machine gun changed everything. Its rate of fire was so rapid that individual shots blurred into a continuous roar, a sound that conveyed not just lethality, but overwhelming volume. Rounds chewed through the trees above Holloway's position, sending bark and splinters cascading down in a shower of debris that stung exposed skin and filled the air with the smell of fresh-cut wood and cordite. The psychological impact of the MG-42 was nearly as significant as its tactical effect. It created a cone of space where movement meant death, where even the bravest soldier would think twice before exposing himself to that volume of fire. Ashford was moving along the line, keeping low, coordinating fire and checking casualties. Holloway saw him pause beside a soldier who was clutching his arm, blood visible even from a distance. The lieutenant applied a field dressing with quick efficiency, then moved on. The patrol was still cohesive, still fighting as a unit, but the situation was deteriorating. They were pinned in unfavorable terrain, taking fire from elevated positions, and the presence of the machine gun meant that any attempt to either assault the ridge or withdraw across open ground would result in significant casualties. A burst of fire raked the ground to Holloway's right, close enough that he felt dirt and stone fragments spray against his leg. He shifted position, moving laterally behind the log to a spot where a cluster of smaller trees offered additional concealment. The movement was calculated, fast enough to minimize exposure, controlled enough to avoid drawing attention through panicked flailing. He settled into the new position and immediately resumed scanning for targets, refusing to let the near miss disrupt his operational focus. The forest that had seemed merely cold and unwelcoming 30 minutes earlier now felt actively hostile, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible indicator of German infantry maneuvering for a better angle or preparing to flank the patrol's position. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made it impossible to judge how long the firefight had been continuing. It might have been 5 minutes. It might have been 20. The only reliable measure was the decreasing weight of ammunition pouches and the accumulating fatigue that came from maintaining high alert while adrenaline burned through the body's reserves. Then the German fire shifted, concentrating on the left side of the patrol's line. Holloway realized what was happening. They were trying to collapse the flank to force the Americans into an even tighter defensive position where the machine gun could achieve maximum effect. It was sound tactics, the kind of maneuver that worked if the defender couldn't respond quickly enough to prevent it. Ashford saw it too. He was shouting new orders, redirecting fire, trying to shore up the threatened section of the line. Holloway fired 3 quick shots at a cluster of movement along the ridge, not certain of hits but needing to add his weapon to the volume of fire that might disrupt the German assault. The Garand's action cycled smoothly, the next round chambering with the mechanical precision that made the weapon reliable even under the worst conditions. He fired again and again, each shot aimed at visible or probable enemy positions. Each trigger pulled a small assertion of agency in a situation where control was rapidly dissolving. The patrol was fragmenting, not through cowardice or panic, but through the simple physics of combat in broken terrain under heavy fire. Soldiers were moving independently now, seeking better cover, trying to maintain firing positions while avoiding the worst of the incoming rounds. The careful formation that had entered the forest was gone, replaced by a scattered defensive line where each man fought his own small battle while trying to remain connected to the larger unit. Holloway found himself separated from the soldiers he had been moving with, isolated in a position where he could see perhaps 3 other members of the patrol, but couldn't effectively communicate with them beyond hand signals that were difficult to execute while under fire. He pressed himself against the cold earth and kept fighting, because that was what training and instinct demanded, because there were no other options, because the only way through this moment was to continue performing the basic tasks of combat until the situation resolved itself one way or another. The rifle fired, the rounds went down range, and somewhere in the confusion and noise, the patrol held its ground, the mechanism of survival. The intensity of the firefight had plateaued into something grimly sustainable. a level of violence that neither side could maintain indefinitely, but that neither could safely disengage from without accepting unacceptable risk. Holloway had lost track of how many rounds he had fired, but the weight of his ammunition pouches told him he was somewhere past halfway through his basic load. The M1 Garand was still functioning perfectly, each shot cycling the action with the reliable mechanical precision that had made the weapon the backbone of American infantry firepower. But ammunition was finite, and the tactical mathematics were simple. Every round he fired brought him closer to the moment when the rifle would become nothing more than an 8-pound club. He had worked himself into a position behind a slight rise in the ground, where a fallen tree had created a natural berm of displaced earth and rotting wood. It wasn't cover in any meaningful sense. A determined burst of fire would chew through it easily, but it provided concealment and gave him a stable firing position from which he could observe a section of the German line. The position also had a significant disadvantage. It was isolated from the rest of the patrol by perhaps 20 yards of relatively open ground that was being swept by intermittent fire from the MG-42. He had moved here during a lull in the German fire, a calculated gamble that the position's advantages outweighed its isolation. Now he was committed to it, unable to move back without exposing himself to the same deadly arc of fire that had driven him here in the first place. The forest around him had been transformed by violence. Trees bore the scars of bullet impacts, pale wounds in dark bark where rounds had struck and penetrated. The ground was littered with spent brass casings, broken branches, and the disturbed earth where bullets had plowed shallow furrows. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and pine sap, a mixture that would have been almost pleasant in different circumstances, but now served as a constant olfactory reminder of the firefight's intensity. Somewhere to his left, a soldier was calling for ammunition, his voice tight with the kind of controlled urgency that came from managing fear while maintaining function. Holloway's hands moved through the practiced sequence of reloading, his fingers working with automatic efficiency, even as his eyes continued to scan the ridgeline. The Garand's on-block clip system meant that he couldn't top off the magazine. Once he started firing, he was committed to expending all 8 rounds before the weapon would accept a fresh clip. It was a limitation that required careful fire discipline, a constant mental calculus of when to shoot and when to conserve ammunition. He pressed his thumb down on the follower and slid a fresh clip into the internal magazine, feeling the mechanism catch and lock. The distinctive ping of the empty clip ejecting had already become part of the soundscape of the firefight, a metallic note that punctuated the deeper reports of rifles and the sustained roar of the machine gun. The Germans were professional soldiers. That much was clear from their fire discipline and tactical coordination. They weren't spraying rounds wildly or allowing themselves to be drawn into wasteful exchanges. They were applying pressure methodically, probing the patrol's defensive line for weaknesses, concentrating fire on specific positions long enough to suppress them before shifting to new targets. Holloway recognized the pattern because he had been trained to recognize it, because the fundamentals of small unit tactics were universal regardless of which side was employing them. The recognition didn't make the experience any less dangerous, but it allowed him to anticipate shifts in the German fire and adjust his own position accordingly. A burst of rounds impacted the fallen tree 6 inches from his right shoulder, the impacts arriving so close together that they sounded like a single extended crack. Splinters erupted from the wood, and Holloway felt the sharp sting of debris against his neck and ear. He ducked lower, pressing himself into the earth, waiting for the follow-up burst that would walk the fire across his position. It didn't come. The German gunner had shifted to a different target, satisfied that he had suppressed this particular position, or simply following the tactical priority of engaging multiple targets rather than fixating on one. Holloway counted to 3, then rose back to a firing position and immediately identified movement along the ridge. A German soldier was repositioning, moving from one covered spot to another in a crouched run that took him across a gap in the tree line. Holloway tracked the movement, led it by a fraction, and fired. The soldier went down, though whether from a hit or from diving for cover, Holloway couldn't determine. He didn't have time to assess the result. Another target was visible farther along the ridge, this one partially concealed behind a tree, but exposed enough that the shot was viable. Holloway adjusted his aim and fired again, working through his training. Sight picture, breath control, smooth trigger squeeze, follow through. The rifle responded exactly as designed, and the round went down range to whatever destination physics and marksmanship determined. The mental state required for sustained combat was difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't experienced it. Fear was present but compartmentalized, existing as a background awareness that never quite rose to the level of panic or paralysis. Training operated as a kind of autopilot, hands and eyes executing tasks that had been rehearsed until they required minimal conscious direction. Time remained distorted, each moment simultaneously compressed and extended, the subjective experience of duration bearing little relationship to what a clock would have measured. And beneath it all was a strange clarity, a heightened perceptual state where details became vivid and immediate. The grain pattern in the Garand's walnut stalk, the way frost melted where his hands gripped the metal, the specific quality of light filtering through gun smoke and tree branches. He was also acutely aware of the fragility of his position, separated from the main body of the patrol, pinned in place by overlapping fields of fire, unable to communicate effectively with command or coordinate with nearby soldiers. These were conditions that reduced survival to the most basic elements. His rifle was the primary tool that stood between him and catastrophe. As long as the weapon functioned and he had ammunition to feed it, he retained agency. He could suppress enemy positions, discourage assault, maintain enough defensive capability to make attacking his position more costly than bypassing it. But if the rifle failed, if it jammed or broke or simply ran dry of ammunition, that agency would evaporate. He would become a static target, unable to influence the tactical situation, dependent entirely on whether other members of the patrol could provide covering fire while he either fixed the problem or withdrew. The weight of that understanding sat alongside the weight of the rifle itself, both physical and psychological burdens that defined his existence in this particular slice of forest on this particular November morning. He fired when targets appeared. He conserved ammunition when they didn't. He controlled his breathing, managed his fear, and maintained the razor-thin margin of focus that combat demanded. The German fire shifted again, and Holloway realized with cold certainty that they were adjusting their positions, working their way closer through whatever covered routes the ridgeline offered. The range was decreasing, the angles were changing, and the isolation of his position, which had seemed tactically acceptable 10 minutes earlier, was becoming increasingly untenable. He glanced back toward where he had last seen other members of the patrol, trying to assess whether the gap between his position and theirs had become crossable. The answer was immediate and discouraging. The same stretch of ground that had been dangerous before was now being actively targeted, rounds kicking up dirt and snapping through the underbrush in a pattern that made movement suicidal. So he stayed where he was, because staying was the only option that didn't involve accepting certain death. The rifle remained solid in his hands, its weight a reassurance and a responsibility. He brought it to his shoulder again, found another target, and continued the work of survival, one trigger pull at a time. The forest pressed in around him. The cold seeped through his uniform. And the war continued its relentless calculation of who would survive the next minute, and the minute after that, and all the uncounted minutes that stretched between now and whatever resolution the day would ultimately bring. The moment of failure, the German advance, had become unmistakable. What had begun as incremental adjustments in firing positions had evolved into a coordinated movement down the ridge, enemy soldiers using the terrain and their own suppressive fire to close the distance in controlled bounds. Holloway could see them more clearly now, not as fleeting shadows or ambiguous shapes, but as distinct figures moving with tactical precision through the trees. They were perhaps 40 yards away, close enough that he could distinguish individual equipment, the coal scuttle helmets, the mottled camouflage smocks, the way their rifles were carried at the ready. The professional part of his mind registered these details with detached clarity, cataloging information that might prove tactically relevant. The more primitive part of his mind, the part concerned only with immediate survival, understood that the decreasing range meant his isolated position was becoming increasingly vulnerable to being overrun. He shifted the Garand slightly, tracking a German soldier who was moving between two substantial trees in a pattern that suggested training and experience rather than panicked desperation. The soldier paused at the second tree, using it as cover while he scanned the American positions. Holloway had perhaps 2 seconds before the German would either spot him or move to yet another position. He settled the front sight post on the center mass of the partially visible target, took up the slack in the trigger, controlled his breathing despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, and began the smooth rearward press that would release the firing pin and send a round downrange. The trigger pulled through its normal arc of travel. The firing pin struck forward, and nothing happened. The absence of the expected report was so unexpected that for a fraction of a second, Holloway's mind couldn't process what had occurred. The trigger had moved correctly. The mechanical resistance had felt normal, but the rifle had failed to fire. There was no recoil, no muzzle blast, no satisfying punch against his shoulder that would have indicated the weapon had functioned as designed. There was only silence where there should have been violence, only mechanical failure where there should have been mechanical precision. His hands moved through the immediate action drill before conscious thought had fully caught up to the situation. Tap the magazine to ensure it was properly seated. Rack the operating rod handle to eject whatever round might be in the chamber, and chamber a fresh one. Attempt to fire again. The sequence took perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds during which his eyes remained on the German soldier who was now moving again. 3 seconds during which the tactical situation continued to evolve regardless of whether his weapon was functional. He pulled the trigger a second time. Again, nothing. The rifle remained inert, a precisely machined collection of parts that had somehow failed in its singular purpose. The cognitive shock of a weapon malfunction in combat was difficult to articulate to anyone who hadn't experienced it. The rifle was not merely a tool, but an extension of agency, the primary means by which a soldier influenced his immediate environment and maintained the capability to defend himself. When that tool failed, it created a rupture in the fundamental contract between soldier and equipment, a sudden awareness that the machinery on which survival depended was fallible. Holloway felt that rupture as a physical sensation. A cold spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the November temperature and everything to do with the immediate recognition of how precarious his situation had become. He pulled back into the minimal cover of the fallen tree, no longer exposing himself to acquired targets because there was no point in exposure without a functioning weapon. His hands were already moving through the next level of malfunction clearance, fingers working with trained efficiency even as his mind raced through possibilities. The M1 Garand was a robust weapon, generally reliable under field conditions, but it was not immune to malfunction. Moisture could cause problems. Dirt could foul the mechanism. A damaged cartridge could jam in the chamber. A broken firing pin could prevent ignition even if everything else functioned correctly. The specific cause mattered less than the immediate reality. The weapon was not firing, and he was in an isolated position, with German soldiers closing the distance. He pulled the operating rod handle fully to the rear and locked it in place, then carefully tilted the rifle to inspect the chamber. A cartridge was visible, apparently properly seated, showing no obvious signs of damage or deformation. He released the operating rod, allowing it to slam forward and chamber the round with the full force of the recoil spring. Then he pulled the trigger again, knowing even as he did so that if the problem was with the firing pin or trigger mechanism, the result would be the same as before. The hammer fell with an audible click. No ignition, no report. The rifle remained silent. The German fire was intensifying, not specifically targeting his position, but sweeping across the general area in a pattern designed to suppress the entire American defensive line. Rounds were impacting the fallen tree and the surrounding ground with increasing frequency. some passing close enough that he could hear the distinctive snap of supersonic projectiles displacing air. The machine gun opened up again from somewhere along the ridge, its rate of fire so rapid that individual shots blurred into a sustained roar. Dirt and bark fragments showered down around him. The war was continuing its work, entirely indifferent to whether one particular soldier's rifle was functional or not. Holloway forced himself to maintain systematic thinking despite the situation's urgency. Panic would not fix the rifle. Rushing would not fix the rifle. Only methodical troubleshooting and precise execution of corrective procedures offered any possibility of restoring the weapon to function. He had perhaps seconds to identify and resolve the problem, but those seconds had to be used correctly or they would be wasted entirely. He thought through the Garand's operation sequence, mentally tracing the path of mechanical action from trigger pull to bullet firing. The trigger pulled the trigger bar. The trigger bar released the hammer. The hammer struck the firing pin. The firing pin struck the primer. The primer ignited the powder. If the sequence was breaking down, it had to be breaking down at a specific point, and identifying that point was the key to corrective action. He pulled the operating rod handle back again, this time paying close attention to the feel of the mechanism. Everything seemed normal, no unusual resistance, no grinding or binding that would indicate damaged parts. He inspected the chamber again, and this time noticed something he had missed in his initial assessment. The cartridge appeared to be seated correctly, but when he looked more closely at the base of the round, he could see a faint impression where the firing pin had struck. The firing pin was working. The primer had been hit, but the cartridge had not ignited. A dud round. One defective cartridge out of the thousands that passed through ammunition production facilities. One primer that had somehow failed to receive the explosive compound that would ignite the powder charge. One round that looked identical to every other round, but lacked the fundamental chemical reaction that made it functional. The odds of encountering a dud were low but not zero. Every soldier knew they existed. Every soldier also knew that discovering one in combat was vastly more consequential than discovering one on a training range. The solution was straightforward in principle. Eject the dud round and chamber a fresh cartridge. But the Garand's design created a complication. The operating rod needed to be pulled fully to the rear to eject a chambered round, and if the N-block clip was not empty, pulling the rod would chamber another round from the magazine rather than leaving the chamber clear for inspection. He couldn't simply extract the dud without cycling another round into position. And if there was a secondary problem, if something was wrong with the chamber or the extractor or any of the other components involved in the firing cycle, he needed to be able to see it clearly before committing to further action. His fingers found the magazine release, a small catch on the right side of the receiver that allowed the internal magazine to drop free. He pressed it and felt the N-block clip fall away, taking with it the remaining rounds that had been loaded. The clip hit the ground beside him with a faint metallic sound that was immediately lost in the ambient noise of the firefight. Now he could work the action without automatically chambering another round. He pulled the operating rod handle fully to the rear, and the dud cartridge extracted from the chamber and ejected, tumbling away to land somewhere in the dirt and leaves. The chamber was now empty. He tilted the rifle to catch what little light penetrated the forest canopy and inspected the interior of the chamber as thoroughly as the circumstances allowed. No visible obstructions, no obvious damage. The extractor looked intact. The ejector appeared functional. If there was a problem beyond the dud round, it wasn't immediately visible. He reached for a fresh clip from his ammunition pouch, his fingers moving by feel because his eyes needed to remain on the chamber and on the peripheral awareness of the German positions that were still advancing. The clip slid into his hand, 8 rounds held in the spring steel frame that the Garand's design required. He positioned the clip above the receiver, aligned it with the guide rails, and began to press it down into the magazine. This was the moment of vulnerability, the seconds when both hands were occupied with reloading and unavailable for firing or for any other task. If the Germans rushed his position now, if they had observed his inactivity and recognized it as evidence of a malfunction or ammunition exhaustion, if they chose this moment to close the distance with grenades and concentrated fire, he would have almost no ability to respond. The clip resisted slightly as it entered the magazine, the follower's spring providing resistance that had to be overcome with steady downward pressure. He kept his thumb carefully positioned to avoid the painful bite that occurred if the bolt slammed forward prematurely and caught flesh between steel surfaces. The clip seated with the distinctive sound that every M1 Garand user knew, a metallic resonance that signaled the weapon was loaded and the bolt had run forward to chamber the first round. Holloway released his thumb and brought the rifle back to a firing position, moving with deliberate speed that balanced urgency against the need for smooth mechanical operation. The weapon felt alive again in his hands, the inert weight transformed back into potential violence. He acquired a target through the sights, a German soldier who had moved into a position less than 30 yards away, close enough now that Holloway could see details of expression and posture. He pressed the trigger, and the Garand fired. The recoil punched back against his shoulder with familiar force. The ejected casing spun away in a glittering arc. The operating rod cycled and chambered the next round. The weapon had returned to function. The malfunction had lasted perhaps 10 seconds, possibly less. But in those seconds, the tactical situation had shifted significantly. The Germans were closer. His ammunition was reduced by the clip he had dropped. And the experience had introduced an element of doubt, a small but persistent awareness that the tool he depended on for survival could fail at the moment when failure meant death. He fired again and again, working through the targets that presented themselves, trying to slow the German advance through the application of accurate rifle fire. But even as he fought, even as his hands performed the practiced motions of aiming and firing, part of his mind remained fixed on those 10 seconds of silence, on the cold shock of mechanical failure, and on the narrow margin between continuing function and catastrophic breakdown that defined existence in this particular war, in this particular forest, on this particular morning when everything could change in the span of a single heartbeat. 10 seconds. The 10 seconds of the malfunction had contained within them a compressed eternity, each moment expanding under the pressure of immediate necessity and the recognition that every fraction of time represented a point where the outcome could shift irrevocably. Holloway's experience of those seconds would remain vivid long after the broader details of the firefight had faded into the generalized memory of combat, precisely because the malfunction had stripped away all abstraction and reduced survival to the most fundamental elements: a soldier, a broken weapon, and approaching enemy forces. What happened in that interval was not heroism in any conventional sense, not a dramatic moment of courage or sacrifice, but rather the execution of practiced procedure under conditions that made practice seem wholly inadequate to the reality. The first second had been consumed by the cognitive shock of the trigger pull that produced no result, the mental stutter as expectation collided with reality and training attempted to reassert control over instinct. His finger had squeezed through the arc of the trigger's travel. The resistance had felt normal, and then nothing. The absence was so complete that for a fraction of that first second his mind had questioned whether he had actually pulled the trigger at all, whether the motion had been imagined rather than executed. But his finger's position confirmed that the trigger had been pulled fully to the rear, and the hammer's forward position visible through a gap in the action confirmed that the firing mechanism had cycled. Something had broken in the chain of mechanical and chemical events that should have produced ignition. The second and third seconds were devoted to the immediate action drill, the standardized response to a failure to fire that had been ingrained through repetition until it became automatic. Tap, rack, ready. The sequence was designed to clear the most common stoppages: a magazine improperly seated, a cartridge failing to chamber completely, and restore the weapon to firing condition with minimal time and attention. His left hand moved to the magazine, delivering a sharp upward blow that would reseat it if it had worked loose. His right hand pulled the operating rod handle fully to the rear, ejecting whatever was in the chamber and allowing a fresh round to feed from the magazine. The motion was smooth despite the adrenaline, his muscles executing the drill with the precision that came from having performed it hundreds of times on ranges and in training exercises. The fourth second was when he attempted to fire again, and confirmed that the immediate action drill had not resolved the problem. The trigger pulled through its travel, the hammer fell, and again, silence. This was the moment when the malfunction graduated from a simple stoppage to a more serious mechanical failure, when the standardized response proved insufficient, and the situation required deeper diagnosis. The German soldier he had been targeting was no longer visible, having completed his movement and disappeared behind substantial cover. But there were others, and they were closer now, and the absence of return fire from Holloway's position would be noticed, would be interpreted as opportunity or vulnerability. The 5th and 6th seconds involved pulling back into cover and making the decision to move beyond immediate action to more detailed troubleshooting. This required accepting that he would not be returning fire for however long the diagnosis and repair took, that his position would effectively be silent and non-contributing to the patrol's defensive effort. It meant becoming a liability rather than an asset, at least temporarily. The weight of that decision was significant, but the alternative, maintaining the illusion of capability while the rifle remained inert, was tactically meaningless. He had to fix the weapon or find an alternative solution, and fixing it required time that the tactical situation did not naturally provide. The 7th second was devoted to locking the operating rod to the rear and inspecting the chambered round, looking for obvious signs of damage or deformation that might explain the failure. The cartridge appeared normal at first glance, brass casing intact, bullet properly seated, primer visible at the base. But when he looked more carefully, he saw the small circular impression where the firing pin had struck the primer cup. The mark was clear evidence that the mechanical portion of the firing sequence had functioned correctly. The firing pin had traveled forward with sufficient force to strike the primer. The primer simply hadn't ignited a dud round. The 8th second brought the recognition of what needed to be done. The dud had to be ejected, the chamber cleared, and a fresh round chambered from a new clip. But the Garand's design meant this couldn't be accomplished without first dropping the magazine, because cycling the action with a loaded clip would simply chamber the next round, without allowing proper inspection of the chamber itself. His thumb found the magazine release and depressed it, the small mechanical catch disengaging and allowing the clip to fall free. The 8-round clip hit the ground beside him, and with it went ammunition he could not afford to waste, rounds that might prove critical as the firefight continued. But there was no alternative. The weapon had to be confirmed clear before new ammunition could be loaded with any confidence it would function. The 9th second was consumed by the inspection of the now empty chamber, his eyes scanning for any obstruction or damage that might cause further problems. The interior of the chamber showed the wear patterns of a weapon that had been in service for months, the fine scratches and discoloration that came from thousands of rounds being fired and extracted. But there were no visible obstructions, no burrs or deformities that would prevent proper chambering and extraction. The extractor claw looked intact. The ejector appeared functional. If there was a secondary problem, it wasn't immediately apparent in the limited examination the circumstances allowed. He had to trust that the dud round had been an isolated failure, that the weapon itself remained mechanically sound. The 10th second was the reloading, the moment of maximum vulnerability, when both hands were occupied with pressing a fresh clip down into the magazine, and his ability to respond to any immediate threat was essentially zero. The clip entered the guide rails and began its downward travel, the follower spring resisting with the familiar tension that had to be overcome through steady pressure. His peripheral vision tracked movement in the German positions, while his hands worked on the rifle, awareness split between the task and the environment in a way that training made possible but that never felt entirely natural. The clip seated, the bolt ran forward, the first round chambered with the solid mechanical sound that indicated proper function. And then the 10 seconds were over. The rifle was live again. He brought it to his shoulder, acquired the closest German target through the sights, and fired. The weapon responded exactly as designed. The recoil was familiar and reassuring. The ejected casing spun away in its predictable arc. The next round chambered smoothly. The malfunction was resolved, reduced now to memory and to the small but persistent doubt that would accompany every subsequent trigger pull. The awareness that the weapon could fail again, that mechanical reliability was never absolute, that survival depended on tools that were themselves subject to the countless variables of metallurgy, chemistry, and chance. He worked through the new clip methodically, firing at targets that presented themselves, suppressing positions that threatened the patrol's defensive line, trying to make up for the seconds of silence when his rifle had contributed nothing to the collective effort to hold the position. Each shot was a reassertion of function, evidence that the weapon was working again. But the experience of the malfunction remained present in his mind. A cold understanding of how quickly capability could evaporate, and how narrow the margin was between being an effective combatant and being simply a man hiding behind inadequate cover while the war continued around him. The German advance had been slowed but not stopped by the patrol's defensive fire. They were still pressing forward, still using fire and movement to close the distance, still executing the kind of coordinated small unit tactics that reflected training and experience. Holloway's position remained isolated, cut off from the main body of the patrol by terrain and enemy fire, dependent entirely on his ability to maintain enough defensive capability to make overrunning his position more costly than the Germans were willing to accept. The rifle was that capability as long as it continued to function, as long as he had ammunition to feed it. He retained the means to influence the tactical situation. The 10 seconds of silence had shown him what the alternative looked like, and that knowledge was perhaps more valuable than any amount of theoretical training could have provided. He fired again, the Garand punching back against his shoulder, the familiar mechanics of recoil and extraction and rechambering playing out with the precision that had been engineered into the weapon's design. The round went downrange toward a German soldier who was attempting to move between covered positions. Whether it hit or missed, whether it killed or wounded, or simply forced the soldier to abort his movement and seek better cover, Holloway couldn't determine with certainty. The result mattered less than the fact that the weapon had fired, that the mechanical chain of events had proceeded from trigger pull through primer ignition to powder burn to bullet acceleration, that the tool he depended on had proven itself functional one more time. The forest pressed in around him. The cold seeped through his uniform. The firefight continued its grinding progression through time and ammunition, and the accumulated stress that came from sustained combat. And Holloway maintained his position, firing when targets appeared, conserving ammunition when they didn't, and carrying with him the compressed memory of 10 seconds that had contained everything essential about the nature of mechanical warfare, the absolute dependence on tools that could fail, the procedural response that training made possible, and the narrow margins that separated life from death on a November morning in a forest whose name he didn't know and whose strategic significance might or might not justify the blood being spilled across its frozen ground. The aftermath and the weight of what remains. The German assault broke against the patrol's defensive line with the kind of grinding attrition that characterized so much of the infantry warfare in the European theater. There was no dramatic turning point, no single heroic action that shifted the tactical balance. Instead, the accumulated effect of sustained defensive fire, the increasing casualties on the attacking side, and the recognition that the American position could not be overrun without accepting unacceptable losses gradually brought the assault to a halt. The German soldiers withdrew in controlled fashion, using covering fire and terrain to break contact without devolving into panicked retreat. They faded back toward the ridgeline, leaving behind the debris of combat-spent casings, equipment discarded to facilitate movement, and the still forms of soldiers who had closed the distance only to discover that the distance could not be closed far enough. Holloway maintained his firing position for several minutes after the German withdrawal became apparent, unwilling to trust that the assault was truly over rather than simply pausing, before another push. His ammunition was running low, perhaps 20 rounds remaining across the clip still in his pouches, and his body was beginning to register the accumulated stress of sustained combat. His hands were shaking slightly, a fine tremor that came from adrenaline exhaustion rather than fear or cold. His shoulders ached from the repeated recoil of the rifle. His hearing was muffled from the sustained exposure to gunfire, everything sounding as though it were coming from a greater distance than the physical spacing suggested. Lieutenant Ashford's voice cut through the diminished noise, calling for a casualty report and a status check on ammunition. Soldiers responded from their scattered positions, confirming that they were functional or calling for medical assistance if they weren't. The patrol had taken casualties. Holloway could see at least 2 men down, one being attended to by a medic while another lay motionless in a position that suggested the kind of stillness that medical attention couldn't address. The numbers would be compiled and reported up the chain of command, where they would become part of the statistical accounting that measured the cost of operations in terms of personnel losses and mission completion rates. Holloway remained in his isolated position for several more minutes, waiting for confirmation that it was safe to move back toward the main body of the patrol. When the signal finally came, he moved quickly across the ground that had been impassable during the firefight, keeping low despite the apparent cessation of German fire, unwilling to trust that a sniper hadn't been left behind to target exactly this kind of movement. He crossed the distance without incident and found himself back among other soldiers, the isolation of combat replaced by the collective presence of the platoon. The medic was working on a soldier who had taken a round through the upper arm, the wound serious enough to require immediate attention, but not immediately life-threatening if properly treated. Blood had soaked through the field, dressing already applied, and the medic was working to control the bleeding with practiced efficiency. Another soldier sat with his back against a tree, his face pale and his breathing shallow, a wound in his leg that had been tourniqueted but that would require surgical attention beyond what could be provided in the field. These were the visible costs of the engagement, the immediate and tangible consequences of the firefight. The invisible costs, the accumulated psychological stress, the erosion of confidence that came from taking casualties, the way each engagement left residue that built up over weeks and months, were harder to quantify but no less real. Ashford moved among the soldiers, checking on their condition and consolidating the patrol's defensive posture, while decisions were made about whether to continue the mission or withdraw back to friendly lines. The original operational objective, reconnaissance along the secondary road, had become secondary to the immediate tactical situation. The patrol had made contact with a German force of unknown size, had sustained casualties, and was now operating in terrain that enemy forces clearly knew and had prepared to defend. Continuing the mission would require accepting additional risk. Withdrawing would mean leaving the objective unaccomplished, but would preserve what remained of the patrol's combat capability. Holloway checked his rifle while he waited for orders, his hands performing the inspection routine that had become automatic. The weapon had functioned flawlessly after the malfunction had been cleared, firing perhaps 40 rounds without any indication of further problems. But the experience of those 10 seconds remained vivid, and he found himself inspecting the mechanism with more attention than usual, looking for any sign of wear or damage that might predict future failure. The chamber was fouled with powder residue but showed no damage. The extractor looked intact. The firing pin, visible through the bolt face, appeared properly positioned. The weapon was mechanically sound, at least to the extent that field inspection could determine. He thought about the dud round, about the randomness of mechanical failure, and how its timing had nearly proven catastrophic. In a different situation, on a training range during a lull in combat, at any moment when his life wasn't immediately dependent on the weapon's function, the dud would have been a minor inconvenience, a statistical anomaly to be noted and corrected. But it had occurred during an assault, when German soldiers were closing the distance, and his ability to return fire was the primary factor determining whether his position could be held or would be overrun. The margin between those outcomes had been measured in seconds, in the time it took to diagnose the problem and execute the corrective procedure. This was the reality of mechanical warfare that the training manuals didn't fully convey. The weapons were remarkable achievements of engineering and mass production, examples of industrial capability applied to military necessity. But they were also assemblages of parts subject to wear, to contamination, to the countless variables that affected mechanical systems operating under field conditions. Firing pins could break. Extractors could fail. Springs could weaken. Ammunition could be defective. And when those failures occurred, they didn't announce themselves through warning signs or allow time for deliberate troubleshooting. They simply happened in the moment, and the soldier had to respond with whatever combination of training, experience, and improvisation the situation demanded. The order came to withdraw. The wounded would be carried, the mission would be logged as incomplete, and the patrol would return to friendly lines to report on what they had learned about German positions and strength. It was not the outcome that had been planned, but it was the outcome that circumstances had produced. And the planners who studied the reports would adjust their maps and their estimates and their future operations based on the information purchased with blood and effort in this particular section of forest. The patrol formed up for movement, spacing adjusted to accommodate the wounded and the reduced combat capability that came from fatigue and ammunition depletion. Holloway took his position in the formation, the Garand settling into its familiar weight across his shoulder. The rifle felt the same as it had that morning when the patrol had moved out. The same balance and heft, the same cold metal and worn wood. But his relationship to the weapon had shifted slightly, marked now by the knowledge of its fallibility and by the compressed memory of 10 seconds when it had failed to fire, and everything had depended on his ability to restore function before the failure became fatal. They moved through the forest in the opposite direction from their advance, retracing the route through terrain that now felt less threatening simply because they were moving away from enemy contact. The woods remained cold and colorless, the pale November light filtering through bare branches in patterns that created the same interplay of light and shadow that had characterized the morning. But the patrol's experience of that terrain had been transformed by violence. The forest was no longer simply space to be crossed, but a place where specific events had occurred, where decisions had been made under pressure, where some men had survived and others had not. Holloway walked in silence, conserving energy for the movement back to friendly lines, his mind processing the engagement in the fragmented way that combat memories formed. Certain details were vivid. The feel of the rifle's mechanism as he worked to clear the malfunction, the specific quality of light on the German soldier's uniform, the sound of rounds impacting the fallen tree that had provided his cover. Other details were already becoming vague, the broader sequence of events blurring into generalized memory of noise and stress, and sustained high alert. This was normal. The mind preserved what seemed important and let the rest fade into the background texture of experience. The weight of the rifle remained constant as he walked, 8 pounds of steel and walnut, a tool that had nearly failed and then hadn't, that had performed exactly as designed for thousands of rounds, and then experienced one anomalous malfunction that the standardized procedures had resolved. The weapon would continue to be carried, maintained, fired, and trusted because there was no alternative. Survival in mechanized warfare depended on tools, and tools were never perfectly reliable, and the soldier's task was to maintain function through whatever combination of training and improvisation the situation demanded. The patrol emerged from the forest into cleared ground where friendly positions were visible in the distance. The tension that had been present since first contact gradually diminished, replaced by the exhaustion that followed sustained combat. They had survived. They would file reports, clean weapons, tend to wounds, and prepare for whatever mission came next. The war would continue, indifferent to individual experiences, measuring progress in kilometers gained or lost, and in casualty figures that abstracted the specific reality of individual firefights into statistical data. Holloway crossed the open ground with the rest of the patrol, the rifle still across his shoulder. The memory of its failure and repair carried alongside all the other memories that accumulated through weeks and months of combat. There was no neat conclusion to draw, no clear lesson that reduced the experience to simple formula. The weapon had failed. He had fixed it. He had survived. Tomorrow or next week or next month, there would be another patrol, another mission, another opportunity for mechanical systems to function or fail under conditions that made the difference between those outcomes absolute. This was the reality of infantry warfare, measured in small moments of decision and repair, in the narrow margins between continuing function and catastrophic breakdown, in the weight of tools that had to be trusted, even when trust itself was revealed as provisional and contingent on factors beyond any individual soldier's complete control. The war would demand the same precision and luck again tomorrow. The rifle would be cleaned, inspected, and loaded. And the cycle would continue until it ended, one way or another, in outcomes that could not be predicted but only experienced as they arrived.